So to continue with the second half of the introduction to the decline of the West, Spengler introduces another one of his main concepts, and it's actually the key concept of the whole work, which is the difference between culture and civilization. And he says he uses them for the first time to mean a sequence, that it's a historical sequence that in every case, in all the great high civilizations, the 9 that he elicits, the culture phase is eventually followed by a civilization phase, which represents the end and final phase of a culture, of a society, a civilization, and is inevitable in every case. And so every one of these great high civilizations, cultures produces a civilization phase. So we have culture versus civilization. And the civilization phase can be found, it corresponds in the ancient world to the Romans. In our world it begins to set in the 19th century, but all the great civilizations have them. And the difference between culture and civilization is, as he sums it up, the difference between what we think of when we think of the Greeks versus the Romans, Greek soul versus Roman intellect. The primary motivating factors of culture, when a society is in a phase of culture, are metaphysics and art. The main thing that is produced is art. Art attains its apogee, as it does in Greece with Polyclitus and Polygnotus and Praxiteles, all the Lysippus, all the great Greek sculptors, and the great works of art, the plays of the tragedians and so forth, and the great buildings, the Doric column that moves and develops into the Ionic column. All of that takes place in the culture period, which then begins to give way, starting with about the time of Alexander the Great. It begins to shift into the Hellenistic phase, and Alexander, who Spengler will say corresponds to Napoleon, begins the shift into the period of intensive culture to extensive culture. In the civilization phase, culture becomes primarily associated with extensivity, with conquering geography and with extensive solutions to cultural problems. And the culture becomes motivated primarily by politics and economics and ethics. First by ethics, later by politics and economics. And this is what we think of when we think of the Roman pragmatic genius. The Romans were irreligious, unspiritual, unmetaphysical, absolutely pragmatic to a fault. They were fact men, and they weren't very good at art, but they were fantastic engineers. They created the Colosseum and the Palatine and these wonderful aqueducts and great Roman roads and all these great architectural and engineering achievements, but they weren't very good at art. And so Spengler says this is the same thing for all the civilizations. In our case, it occupies, the culture phase extends down to about the year 1800 or so, with Napoleon coming in and beginning to announce the shift into extensivity, the obsession with the beginnings of what will eventually turn out to be the creation of empire. The final phase of a civilization is an imperium, the creation of an empire, what Toynbee calls a universal state. That's the Roman Empire. In the case of Egypt, it's the new empire that begins with the Egyptian New Kingdom. With China, it's the period of the shift into the Qin Empire at about 220 BC, with the rise of Qin Shi Huangdi as the great first emperor of China. And Qin Shi Huangdi was absolutely concerned, non-metaphysical, not the least bit interested in metaphysics. And Qin Shi Huangdi was a major trauma for Chinese civilization, because we have the burning of the books and the pursuit of intellectuals, the persecution of intellectuals, and we have the building of all these new roads and new buildings and a standard coinage, a standardization of weights, measures, writing, new forms of technology begin to come in. All of this preoccupation with technology, and it's all pragmatic, it's very Roman, and there's not the least bit of interest in metaphysics, and metaphysicians are actually persecuted during the time of Qin Shi Huangdi. So that's the great universal state that announces the ending of Chinese civilization. Now this can last indefinitely. Obviously with China it went on for centuries, centuries after that. So once a culture reaches the state of civilization, and particularly the final stage of civilization, which is the creation of an imperium, that imperium can exist indefinitely. And the society just exists in a kind of state of petrifaction. It's basically outside of history. It shifts into an ahistorical mode in which the politics shift out of the politics of ideas into the politics of brute zoological force. And this, of course, is equivalent in ancient Rome to the breakdown of the Roman Republic and the shift into Caesar's, where power is centralized by a dictator. And if you want to get into office, you have to assassinate the dictator and take his place and hope the Praetorian Guard agree with your choice. It's all force politics. It's based on assassinations. The machinery from the previous Republican period may still be there, the Senate and so forth, but it's a sham. It's a charade. The real power lies with the dictator during the Imperium. And so art becomes, and metaphysics become absolutely negligible when a culture enters into this civilization phase, as the classical world entered into it with the Hellenistic period, beginning with Alexander the Great. And so we have also the distinction between the types of cities, between culture and civilization. We get the rise of the city. We get the opposition in the civilization phase of world city versus province. The world city now is the Cosmopolis, and the Cosmopolis rises into being as a purely artificial, megalopolitan mode of being in which we have vast, impersonal swarms of human population pouring in from the countryside, from all these cities that now, in the previous culture period, places like Athens, are becoming provincial. And so places like, in our case, Florence, and let's say Weimar, these places which were great culture capitals during the period of the culture phase become mere provinces, and in our case we get Berlin and New York as these great urban cosmopolises that now begin to displace and render the previous cities merely provincial. During the culture phase, these smaller provincial cities had been engaged in a struggle with the countryman and the countryside, and then they gradually obsolesce the countryside, so we have a movement from the countryside to the small-scale town or city, then to the cosmopolis in the civilization phase. And the mentality of the cosmopolis is, as I've said, is very impersonal. You have the rise of the type of inhabitant that you have is the intellectual, who is very haughty and arrogant, who is traditionless and has nothing but scorn for tradition, scorn for religion, very cynical-minded, the fact man, the pragmatist of the world city, the one who just has no interest whatsoever in tradition, in religion and piety, which he regards as fossils left over from a previous age. And of course, this is the modern inhabitant of New York or LA to a T, but it was also the inhabitant of Rome and places like Rome and Alexandria in the days of the classical civilization. And you get these huge populations that swarm into these cities. They're nomadic and they're uprooted and they are looking for work, and they swarm into these cities because they've been displaced by the countryside. Very often wars have displaced them, and they lose their relationship to the earth. In the culture phase, these people are sprung like plants almost organically out of the earth. They're rooted to particular places. They trace their descent through bloodlines. They're very concerned with the purity of blood and tradition and piety, conventions in art, and limits on the knowledge growth of science and technology. All that is effaced and done away with by the rise of the modern megalopolis, the great urban agglomerations with these populations that live in tenements. They live in squalor. In ancient Rome, we had these buildings called insula, which were massive multi-story buildings that were these squalid little apartments that even wealthy people lived in, exactly as in New York. We've got these giant tenement buildings with skyscrapers, huge apartment buildings. The Romans had those too. Very often they would collapse in earthquakes because they were very poorly thrown together. But the population seemed to be quite content to live in these human ant hills, basically. And the concern now is primarily money. Money becomes the ruling factor. As Spengler says, it's possible to understand the evolution of Greek culture without any reference to the economic life, whereas it is only the economic life that is the primary concern of Roman civilization. All these men who later become members of the first and second triumvirate had massive private fortunes. They were millionaires, and money becomes absolutely decisive in anything that you do in this late phase of civilization. And of course, that's exactly the case today. To play in politics, you need to raise very large sums of money to get anywhere in politics today. And so he also says then that we have the shift between Greek soul and Roman intellect. In ancient civilization, we can also think of the analogy between the Greek and Roman analogy, parallels in Mesoamerican civilization, the distinction between Mayan culture and the Aztecs, whereas for the Mayans, culture was very lyrical, and we got the greatest Mesoamerican sculpture ever made is done in the Mayan cities of Palenque and Copan and all these great Mayan cities. But in the Aztec cities, the art declines, it stiffens and petrifies into a fixed stock of conventions and formulae. And the Aztecs were, of course, very pragmatic, militarists, warriors, and they turned human sacrifice into a mass production industry. Just as with the Hellenistic period, you have the creation of these latifundia, which are these vast slave plantations that come in the 2nd century BC, which are the equivalent to modern corporations that enslave human beings in places like Sicily and Magna Graecia, and they produce massive, wine and olive oil and all these crops, but they're huge, and they correspond to our modern-day corporations. So there are these phenomena of gigantic machines that enslave human beings during these phases of culture. And the shift, you can also see the same shift, by the way, in Islamic civilization. This is the difference between the Umayyads and the Abbasids on the one hand, and the Ottoman Empire on the other. The Ottoman Empire was not the least bit interested in philosophy or art very much. It was a very pragmatic civilization. The intellectual achievements of the Ottomans lie precisely in the sciences. They wrote lots of science textbooks and treatises. They were one of the first people to introduce gunpowder into the West. They were very pragmatic militarists concerned with the formation of empire, exactly like the Romans. The great intellectual achievements were done by the Arabs in Western Islam, where the Arabs were the main philosophers, people like Avicenna and Al-Farabi and so forth. They were the great Western philosophers, whereas Eastern Islam, the Persian Islam, produced all the great mystics and poets like Rumi and Nizami and Ferdowsi and so forth. But the Ottomans are the great pragmatic men in that culture, and the Ottoman Empire was indeed a universal state that was created by that civilization. And we see the same thing in Egypt with the creation of the new empire after the Egyptians are attacked by the Hyksos. They expel the Hyksos and they become imperialists, and they move out into the Middle East, just as the Americans are doing today in response to 9/11, and conquered the entirety of the Near East, turned it into a giant empire. And Egyptian culture forms at that point stiffened into a fixed stock of forms. They stopped building pyramids, and they started drilling into the rock these tombs. They used a single giant mountain, a ready-made monument, as it were, to bury their kings in the new dynasty, the new empire, rather than building each one a separate monument, as though they're slowly running out of great creative power, just as the Romans slowly ran out of great creative power over time. And so the shift then is introduced by, you can see here the influence on Nietzsche, on Spengler rather, of Nietzsche's idea of the Socratic man. His discussion in The Birth of Tragedy of the Socratic man, and the introduction on stage of the Socratic man, which represents this shift from culture to civilization, insofar as the Socratic man is the avatar of pure intellect. He's the rational man par excellence, who comes on stage and begins to exterminate the culture, begins to introduce turbulence, intellectual turbulence, and perturbations that disrupt and rupture and destabilize the culture forms until they start collapsing, at least the traditional culture forms, the ones that came out of the Kultur period of the civilization. They begin to collapse. Religion becomes analyzed under the gaze of the scientific method. Rationalism begins to replace and displace piety. Descartes is one of the first men in European civilization to embody this purely civic intellectual mentality that he turns around and pours on the scholastics and begins to rationalize, introduce rationality in a severe, serious, withering way into Christianity. So that's the characteristics of the main shift.